Make your product simpler earlier and learn from there. It's an obvious premise. We still struggle with it. We're going to talk about minimum viable products today on Builder Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization with a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. The phrase minimum viable product was introduced more than 20 years ago to address a very common software development challenge. Everyone wants a lot of whiz-bang features that distract from the core idea of testing the premise of building that bit of software in the first place. We're going to talk about minimum viable products today. To do that, I'm joined by Aaron Mulder. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Chariot Solutions, a firm we've known for a long time. Aaron, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Absolutely. So MVP, minimum viable product. This was comes out of software development 20 plus years ago. I think it's kind of reached a mainstream understanding. It's in the ethos, I think, at least people who are building in and around software, building certainly around company building. Eric Ries popularized this with lean startup methodology. There's a lot of logic over the last 20 years, but we're still not great at it. And before we get in, I'm super interested in this idea that we keep adding software tools and learnings, and I gotta feel like that's making things cheaper and simpler and more obvious. But our expectations for what a bit of software is supposed to look like, what mobile applications or websites or tools are supposed to be, are growing. So expectations higher, but tools are more readily available. Is building the most minimum viable product getting easier or harder over time?
Yeah, I think the actual building is getting easier because you're right. The tools get better, day after day. But agreeing on what to build is not so easy because those expectations are higher. We've all used so many mobile apps, so many websites. They've got a lot of features. They can, sync between devices and things. And we've kind of come to expect some of this stuff. So when it comes to the MVP, those expectations play into what people want to build. And even if the tools are better, if there's more you feel needs to be in the MVP, then it becomes more of a challenge.
Talk to me a bit about the most common pitfalls that get us into trouble in the first place. I'm at a large corporation. We've decided that we're going to roll out a new feature for an existing product or perhaps a new product line altogether, or I'm at a ground zero startup that has an idea for my business and step one to build it. What do folks consistently still stumble over?
Well, again, it's identifying what needs to go into that MVP. For a startup, no one's ever used the product before. So you have an idea, you think you know how people are going to use it or what features they'll appreciate in it. But until it gets in front of a user, you don't really know that. So if you try to build everything up front, it's easy to go astray. For a big established company, the problems are different. They have a large audience of users already. They may have websites, phone support, an older version of the app, whatever that, kind of sets a bar. And, if you say, let's build this MVP that only has a couple of features, they'll say, no way. We don't want to put something in front of all those customers that only does a quarter of the job, so either way, I think the danger is that the MVP gets too big and out of control, and then it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It becomes the first release of the software rather than being an MVP.
Can you just say a moment there? You hit on an interesting point there. Yeah. What for you in your long career is the difference between a minimum viable product and the first release of the software?
Well, I feel like the MVP should be a fact-finding mission, right? You should be looking for things and trying to prove things out and trying to figure out, what the customer experience is and should be. And, some of those features are just peripheral to that. Cloud Sync is a great feature to have, but is that what the core of your product is? Probably not. So, maybe that doesn't belong in the MVP. But, if a user is going to have to do repetitive things in the product, making that easy, automating what you can automate. I mean, there are things you really do want to do. And the point of the MVP is to find those things. What are you doing right? What are you doing wrong? How are people using it? where's the friction that maybe you could take out of the process. So I think the struggle with the MVP is to identify, what are those facts you're trying to find, and then build just enough to do that, and then maybe iterate a little before you get to the first release of the product. It may be that the first release needs more features, but the MVP can maybe answer those questions without those features. And that's I think one of the big differences.
I'm hoping you can get a couple like little mini case studies or at least examples, but I want to linger, I suppose, on a point you just made there. I've heard in the past that you might separate minimum viable product as being, in some sense, I don't want to say selfish act, but it's far more focused. So you said fact finding, like I'm trying to answer a question, and so maximizing user experience is part of the actual software. Of course, the end product you want to be so maximally valuable for the user, like Cloud Sync. I want to be able to have multiple devices all appear similar, but that's probably not the specific question you're trying to answer. If you're building a mobile application for the first time, or you're releasing a product, or for my purposes, this is translatable across industries. Even if you're not building software, there are lessons from MVP logic of what is the most specific and narrowest premise you're trying to test the assumption of. Don't assume and how do you solve that? Maybe back us into that. Do you have kind of like a case study on hand that we could talk a little bit about and how you navigate that tension?
Sure. So I'll start with a startup. We've worked with an app called Journal My Health. That's pretty much what it sounds like, making a daily journal of your health if you have chronic conditions or whatever. And, it's a mobile app, and ultimately it needs Cloud Sync and it needs, a login system. But the MVP, way back in the beginning, the mission was, how can we make journaling easy and fun and encourage people to do it, and not, make it difficult and painful and something they don't want to do? Because ultimately, if they're coming in every day to make journal entries, then the product succeeds. And if it's so obnoxious that they skip it day after day, then the product fails, right? So the journaling experience is what needed to be in the MVP. And one of the things we discovered when we put this in front of people was there was stuff that they didn't want to, manually put into their journal entries that maybe we could bring in automatically. We can pull in the weather from a third-party service. We can pull in their, activity and sleep and things from an Apple Watch or a Fitbit. And that is a higher priority than, Cloud Sync and stuff. Ultimately, we're going to have to address, from the perspective of the MVP, ultimately we would have to address those issues and have now. But during the MVP, you can say, I'm sorry, we just don't support upgrading your phone and moving all your data to a new device, but we'll get there, right?
Right.
Not in the MVP, it'll be in the product. Then, on the other hand, we worked with a very large company that had an established, website. They had phone support, and they wanted to build an app. And they came to us and laid down, these 300 wireframes, and that's not an MVP, right? But they have customers, and those customers have expectations, and they say, we don't want to put something in front of those customers where now they have to use the website and the phone support and an app. Like, that just made things more complicated for them. So they didn't want, an app that doesn't do everything, but that's not the point of the MVP, right? The point of the MVP is, if you're building this, how can you build something that will work the best it can for those customers? And let's find that out with something very small and a very small group of customers, and not treat it like it's our first release. So in this case, the app dealt with physical locations, and some people only had one location they worked with, but others had multiple locations they were responsible for. And one of the things to discover during that MVP is, how do you solve this so customers don't have to pick a location, do a thing, pick another location, do a thing, pick another location, do a thing, instead of maybe being able to pick several locations at once and do the thing once, or remember a group of locations they commonly work with. that kind of stuff much better to work out up front before you go building these, 300 screens. It'll make all the screens better. It'll make better use of your time. And you shouldn't fear, the reaction of your customers, because you shouldn't be putting it in front of all your customers, right? You should be finding a small group that's representative, that's, focused and willing to work with you. And, that's the MVP audience.
Yeah, I don't. One can wax poetic about minimum viable products because I think it does extend so widely. A nerdy point that I messaged to you ahead of this interview was one of my favorite life philosophies is to not fall in love with a solution you care about, but fall in love with a problem you want to solve. And I try to remind myself, because I feel the tension. We're in the brainstorming meeting and we're trying to figure out a problem, and I get my little widget idea, and I'm like, oh, what a good idea that is. I really want it, and it then becomes about ownership. I want that there. I didn't decide if we need it or if the end user it's at a high priority, or even if it's close to the actual core assumption we're testing. I've just somewhere in there developed a bit of ownership. And in my sense of running meetings, either building product roadmaps or even just like constructing a set of priorities, I think that's one of the biggest dangers that get you to overbuilding an MVP, that you fall in love with your little intervention, and then the boss or the team lead needs it because it was their idea and they really, really want it there, even though it has nothing to do with what core problem. Have you seen that play out in like kind of the software building side of things?
Yeah, and I think what we try to do then is shift the focus more to the customer, and ultimately we should be happier if the customer is happier, the end user is happier or having a better experience, and try to get our gratification that way rather than by seeing our specific idea implemented. Now, of course, I don't want to go to a product team and say you're wrong, but I'm willing to go to a product team and say, let's put this in front of some customers and see how it goes. And maybe it'll go well and maybe it won't. I mean, maybe it's all flash, but it makes things too complicated. Or, maybe there's some genius there. But it's hard for me to know before we put it in front of the customers. And the more rewarding thing for me is to see the customers come back and say, wow, this really made my life easier. I love how simple it is to do the things I want to do every day. That I think is a better feeling than, I implemented something snazzy. And I would hope that, we could we could convince the product owners of the same. I mean, I think they feel it too. If you get a customer support email that says your app is the greatest, I just have this one suggestion for you. I mean, how does that not feel good, right? And often it's the greatest because you've made their job easier or made what they're trying to do easier, not because, of some particular flash you put in there.
I'm going to lose you in a sec. So, I mean, generally I'd take the final bit of advice of someone going into a meeting, perhaps later today, to talk about that next feature or that product roadmap or like the plan to stand up an application. If there's any bit of advice or how you navigate that specific tension when, sometimes I'm sure there are times where you've had, I'm not sure if that actually needs to be in the MVP, because I get why it is pretty core to the question you're asking, but it seems a little out of it. So have you navigated tensions in some way, or any advice for others to do the same?
Yeah, I mean, it's often not the case that something is wrong, right? It's not the case that a feature shouldn't be in there at all. It's just a question of when, right? I would never go to someone building an app and say, don't build Cloud Sync ever, right? But maybe not now. So I guess the advice is to focus on what are those questions you're trying to answer with the MVP. What is the information you most need to build the product that people are going to love? And, try to use that to, I wouldn't say to rule things out, but to arrange your timeline to, what goes into the MVP, what goes into the next couple iterations, and then what goes into the first full release of the product. What's going to make the user's life better and easier, and end up with you getting those emails that say your product is great. I just have one more thing I'd like to see in it.
I can't imagine a better way to go out. That is the email you're all after. And I really like this idea of the clearest takeaway from this conversation I'm getting is you got to be able to write down that really specific assumption you're trying to test, or that very specific premise you're trying to prove wrong. And it might not be cloud sync on day one. I appreciate it. It's a window into building minimum viable products. Aaron Mulder, Chief Technology Officer of Chariot Solutions. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.